Well, welcome, folks. Thank you for joining this Wild and Scenic Rivers training series session on Section 7 determination. Probably something that no one in the world would ever want to learn about unless you have to work on wild and scenic rivers, because it's so important. And we have some real great experts here to share their knowledge with you. My name is Risa Shimoda. And we have here with us today Nancy Taylor, who goes by Taylor, who has been a wilderness and wild and scenic river specialist for the Forest Service, currently retired, and from the Pacific Northwest. Hector Santiago, who is not retired, the Regional Rivers Coordinator for the National Park Service in Omaha, and Dave Cernicek, who's a wild and scenic river manager in the wonderful area of Bridger-Teton National Forest for the U.S. Forest Service. So if we added up all the people, all the years of experience, it would kind of probably blow everyone's mind. So we're really thrilled to have these folks here. And thank you for attending, because we know everybody has lots going on. So just wanted to mention again that we're in the middle of a training series. We have done kind of a 101 last week. Actually, Taylor and Liz Lacey were the instructors, and for which we will be coming out with the recording. And we have one more in our series, Managing Eligible Rivers. It will be Dave Cernicek is actually going to be doing that with Ryan Turner, who works for the BLM on the Lower Salmon, and that's going to be on May 20th. So just like to both welcome you and hear kind of some ground rules. Just if you have questions, raise your hand. I think we'll try to wait for questions until the end, but if there's something like you can't hear or you have a specific question, like I don't understand what that acronym is or something like that, please put it in the chat. If we are not getting to you, raise your hand. And here's just a little bit about the River Management Society if you're not familiar with us. Lots of wild and scenic river resources that are on the website, over 50 video recordings, videos of wild and scenic specific topic sessions, and over hundreds, literally hundreds of webinars and meetups on hydropower, workplace culture, and other river related topics. So you can definitely check it out at river-management.org. And plugging our membership, just for a second, we're all about training, having you learn from peers and colleagues, people who do work for and on rivers, and lots of opportunities to meet them, interact with them, look them up, and be better at your work. So I'm going to hand it over to Hector now, who's going to take us on our way. And so Hector, take it away.
Thank you, Risa. Greetings, everybody, from sunny Omaha, Nebraska is where I am located. Purpose of our presentation today is all about Section 7. Section 7A of the Wild Scenic Rivers Act, what defines a water resources project, factors to consider when Section 7A applies, analysis or evaluation standards, exploring unique situations and scenarios in the context of 7A, and we'll have a couple of hopefully good examples for you. Next. So to start, what is Section 7A of the Wild Scenic Rivers Act? It may be arguably one of the most consequential sections of the Wild Scenic Rivers Act, particularly when it comes to dealing with projects in the river and environmental compliance related to projects. And Section 7A of the Wild Scenic Rivers Act states, in part, no department or agency of the United States shall assist by loan, grant, license, or otherwise in the construction of any water resources project that would have a direct and adverse effect on the values for which such river was established. Next. So the intent of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, to simplify it, is keep rivers free flowing, protect designated study rivers from the effects of in-stream construction by regulating federal actions, and focusing on the modification of the waterway in the rivers and its banks within the Orient high water mark. And I always like to say it's federal actions that we are having control over. And as we're talking about free flowing condition, there is a definition in the Act for free flowing condition I like to pull out. And it is existing or flowing in natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification of the waterway. And I also like to mention that last part we oftentimes ignore. Provided that this shall not be construed to authorize, intend, or encourage future construction of such structures within components of the National Wild Scenic River System. That relates to projects, new rivers, having water resources, having dams and diversions. That doesn't preclude them, for example, from designation, but it also doesn't mean that that's an activity we like to encourage. Next. So at a glance again, 7A, it prohibits the licensing of new hydro projects, or what's called project works, from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's probably the strongest prohibition under Section 7A and under the Wild Scenic Rivers Act. It requires a determination by river administering agencies like Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. And then at the time of designation, as part of the study process, rivers are classified. And that classification doesn't tend to have an effect on Section 7 determinations directly. So we don't necessarily consider classification in the determination. But what it does do is set a baseline and to the conditions that we're set to protect and enhance as part of our management of the river and as we implement Section 7A. So protecting and enhancing those ORVs. Thanks. So with that, Risa likes to say Hector's 10A. It's everybody's 10A management direction from the Wild Scenic Rivers Act. What's important to note is that the Wild Scenic Rivers Act is a non-degradation enhancement policy. And so we protect by avoiding or eliminating adverse effects to ORVs. And the whole point is for us to maintain or improve the condition of the river at the time of designation. The challenge is people use rivers. So, allowing for recreation and other uses to happen while not degrading river values. That's the balance that we try to hit in some way, and sometimes it's more challenging than others. One of the blowouts there, think no impacts, not mitigation. In particular, unlike 404 permits, we don't mitigate, we avoid impacts is where we'd like to be. Next. So when does the 7A apply? Important to note, not all projects require a 7A. So there are specific triggers and factors to consider prior to embarking on a Section 7A determination. So in this slide, I'm trying to call out very quickly the triggers for 7A. A project involves construction within the ordinary high water mark or the bend banks of the river. A project that requires a Clean Water Act Section 404 permit from Rivers or Rivers Harbors Act from the Army Corps of Engineers. And of course, a project that requires funding and grants and loans or permits from other federal agencies, including Federal Highways, FEMA, State Departments of Transportation, and the National Park Service and other agencies. Taylor?
All right, thanks, Hector. So to go into more detail about these triggers or factors that you need to consider to determine whether a Section 7 applies to a proposed project, we're going to talk about these 5 different factors in more detail, but We'll ask if the project involves federal assistance. Is it located in a river segment that's designated under certain sections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? What's the project location? Is it within the protected river corridor, or is it upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to that Wild and Scenic River? The fourth one, is it a hydroelectric project licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which you'll hear me refer to as FERC? And the fifth one, is the project a water resources project? And we'll get into the definition of what that means because it's very specific. Next slide. So that first one, does it involve federal assistance? So if it's any type of assistance from a federal agency, and this can be permits, fundings, loans, grants, licenses, technical assistance, and if there is any kind of federal assistance, Section 7 applies to the projects proposed on both public and private land. And some of the other definitions and factors will make more sense when we talk about private land, such as being in the bed and banks or below the ordinary high water mark of the river. Next slide. So some examples of what federal assistance can be. We mentioned a FERC authorization. Hector talked about the Army Corps of Engineers, the permits for wetlands and navigable waters. So going back to the FERC, it can be license, permit, preliminary permit, or some other authorization, and those are required to provide authorization for non-federal hydropower projects and interstate gas pipelines, and has some authority over interstate electric transmission lines as well. So the Army Corps permits, this would be for work in stream channels or wetlands. So this is pursuant to the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And you'll hear them called Section 404 or dredge and fill permits. The federal assistance can also include federal funding of projects such as on state highways. And we already mentioned grants, loans, it can be technical assistance from a federal agency, can be proposed projects by your own agency. So there are projects on non-federal lands that don't involve any federal assistance. So these can be construction projects that are funded, say, by state or local governments, or if they're completely funded by private parties on their own private lands. So if the project that you're reviewing doesn't have any federal assistance, then Section 7 is not required. But if it does involve federal assistance, then we go on to the next factor to continue determining whether Section 7 applies. Next slide. So the next thing we think about is, does Section 7 apply, or what is the designation status of the river to determine if Section 7 applies? So it applies to all designated rivers by a state, which is under 2AII of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, or designated by Congress, which is under Section 3A of the Act. And Section 7 applies to all congressionally authorized study rivers as well, and this is for varying periods of time. So this distinction between designated and study rivers affects which evaluation standard is used. One of the really important points is Section 7 does not apply to rivers identified for study by agencies. So these are rivers that have been determined to be eligible or suitable under the framework of your agency's land and resource management planning processes. So for the Forest Service, which I'm most familiar with, under forest planning processes. But it's really important to note that even if Section 7 doesn't apply to these eligible and suitable rivers, each agency does have their own policies to protect them while they're being considered by the agency for inclusion into the national system. So they do have protections, they're just under agency policy. And Section 7 applies whether the river is classified as wild, scenic, or recreational. And we talked about classification in the webinar last week. Next slide, please. So this slide is a little bit busy, but I did just want to essentially talk about what I said in the last slide in more of a graphic representation. So we have designated rivers under sections 2A, II, you'll hear it called, or Section 3A of the Act. So you would apply Section 7A to those rivers if Section 7 applies to the project. Under Section 5A, which are congressionally authorized study rivers, you would apply Section 7B. And then we just talked about those agency authorized or agency identified study rivers. Under Section 5D1 of the Act, you do not apply Section 7, but again, there is agency policy that has protections for those rivers. Next slide. So the next factor we talk about is the location of the project and how it is located relative to the protected river corridor. So you need to know the exact project and boundary locations of that designated river or protected stream corridor. You'll also need a map of the larger watershed in which that stream corridor is located so that you can determine where the project is, the footprint of it is. So you need to answer these two questions. Is it located within a designated wild and scenic river section or a Section 5A study corridor? And is it located upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to a wild and scenic river or a Section 5A study river and outside of the river corridor? So if the answer is yes to both of these questions, then we'll go on to the next slide for kind of the next step. If yes, if it's within that protected corridor or outside the corridor, but still upstream, downstream, or on a tributary to it, that location will help you determine what evaluation standard to use. And Hector's going to talk more about those. Next slide. So the next factor is the project a hydroelectric project licensed by the FERC? So if it is, no Section 7 is required because this is a prohibition, meaning that a newly constructed hydropower project is not allowed within a designated river or congressionally authorized study river. So even if it isn't within a protected corridor, it's not allowed to directly affect the protected river corridor. Now, these are very complex. There's always a lot of questions associated with these, so get help on these because there's a lot of nuances and a lot of complexities. Hydropower projects can also apply to uplands within the Wild and Scenic River Corridor, not just below the ordinary high water mark, which we'll talk about in just a second, of the river. So project facilities such as pipelines and transmission lines may occupy upland areas. And again, get help, ask questions because these can be very complex. Next slide. Okay, so the last factor I'm going to talk about is the project a water resources project? So this is specifically defined as any project that involves construction below the ordinary high water mark of the river or stream. So this ordinary high water mark is consistent with features that are such as a topographic break and slope. So that'd be essentially the tops of the channel banks, a change in sediment characteristics. So texture of sediment and soil development, changes in vegetation characteristics. So the density of vegetation, the maturity, species composition. And you would correlate two or more of those factors, indicators whenever possible, because just using one, it can be misleading because what we know is rivers can be very dynamic, a lot of changes very quickly. Big events can happen. So using more than one indicator can be really helpful. Get help again from other specialists if you can, biologists, hydrologists, others who can really help you understand where that ordinary high water mark is. But a good rule of thumb is to ask whether any portion of the project will get wet. So this would be considering changing flow regimes and that dynamic nature of rivers over many years. So if only a portion of a project will get wet, such as the bottom of a piling for a bridge, then the entire project is still considered a water resources project. And even if it's temporary and it's only there for a short period of time or a limited period of time, but it's still part of it gets wet and is down there in the bed and banks, which is another term you'll hear, it is considered a water resources project. Again, if it's related to a FERC project, a dam, water conduit, reservoir, powerhouse, transmission line, or other project works under the Federal Power Act, which Hector mentioned, Any other kind of construction or developments which would affect the free-flowing characteristics of a river, get help again, ask questions because of those complexities. And next slide. And this slide, I can't claim it as my own. I borrowed it, but I just thought for a little bit of humor, if you can define and find the ordinary high water mark in this complex river system, oh, you're amazing, because this is what you can be up against in trying to figure out, okay, we have a project proposed somewhere in here. Where is that ordinary high water mark? So just to have a little fun and to illustrate the complexity of figuring this out from time to time. Next slide. Okay, so Reese is going to click through some numbers here to just talk about this diagram to help you understand what we mean by ordinary high water mark. And so the first one, the width and elevation of the active channel boundaries are marked with dotted red lines. And then in number 2, we have the ordinary high water mark marked by a blue line. And with number 3, the main channel always has base flow, whereas the secondary channel is ephemeral and flows only in response to storm events. And then 4th, the active channel boundaries of the main and secondary channels are at the top of the natural levee. The top of the natural levee is the same elevation as the ordinary high water mark in this diagram. And then the 5th one, when flows rise above the natural levee, the flow is not contained with a channel and the flow spreads across the floodplain. And the floodplain would be considered to be above and beyond the high water mark because it's a higher elevation than the natural channel. So just to help you get, again, a graphic representation of an example of ordinary high water mark. Next slide. So, some examples of water resources projects. So we have in the upper left photo, this is a whitewater park project that places boulders in a channel to create features for boaters. And it would be a water resources project because it's in the river and it's actually intended to alter the direction and rate of flow to create those whitewater features for them. In the upper right photo, a boat dock and parking area for vehicles would also be considered a water resources project because a portion of the boat dock would be below the ordinary high water mark, and boat ramps are often this way as well. In the lower right photo, a road construction project that's located completely in the uplands, but still within the protected stream corridor would not be considered a water resources project because none of it gets wet. It's in the uplands. There'd be other processes besides Section 7 that we would use because this is not a water resources project. And I will turn it over to Hector.
Thank you, Taylor. So a little bit about Section 7 evaluation standards. Next slide, please. So depending where a project is located in relation to the designated segment of the river, there are different evaluation standards that apply. And this is information you'll want to provide to the assisting agency, for example, the Corps of Engineers. Under what authorities and under what evaluation standard might you be implementing or doing a Section 7A evaluation? So here I've got them listed. Ultimately, the points I wanted to make here, you can see them all listed there. There's a dam in the red asterisk, so that is where the prohibition on or directly affecting applies. Very limited as to the kinds of activities we can add to existing dams, and certainly not any new dams. The one we deal with oftentimes the most, I think, probably is the direct and adverse effect evaluation standard. The point to make there is also, and it's been mentioned, I think, earlier in the presentation, where these are projects within the main stem, water resources projects within the ordinary high water mark, federal assistance that are occurring within the main stem of the river, but also rivers that have established boundaries. So our federal, certainly our federal unit boundaries that we have. Those tributaries within those boundaries are also subject to the direct and reverse effect. So it's tributaries to within that river corridor or established boundary. And then we have the invade the area and reasonably diminish to those three values, the scenic, recreational, and fish and wildlife values. A lot of times what it amounts to is, can we see it from the river, from the main stem of the river? That'd be scenic. How is it being recreated, and what kind of connection with respect to paddling or other types of recreational uses there might be? And then fish and wildlife values, oftentimes that's all about how the fish are using the river. Is there significant anadromous fish movement or other types of fish access issues that we want to consider? And then I do that last point down there about avoid or eliminate. This is actually came out of, we get sued every once in a while. Back in 2010, the Stillwater Crossing decision on the St. Croix. The bottom line is this goes back to the fact that we don't mitigate like in a 4-4 permit where you have impacts and then you can go anywhere and kind of mitigate those impacts. In fact, it's a in situ mitigation, no net impacts is the goal that we have with our projects. And we call that avoid or eliminate. So next. And then this one here, all I wanted to point out is this is, if you notice the change here, it's a section B, a congressionally designated study rivers, and candidate section 2A2 rivers. Most of those evaluation standards apply, except the invade the area is upscaled to even being more protective during the study process. That's why you see the unreasonably X'd out. So it's invade the area or diminish. So that's the evaluation standard. It's slightly more protected during that period of time when we're trying to keep everything just so and get a river designated. Next. So our direct and adverse effect, I think the point I wanted to bring out here the most, you've already heard about where the standards apply on tributaries and such, but that last bullet right there, referencing the comprehensive river management plan for your RV descriptions, I think it's really important to understand the relationship between how we describe our RVs, our water quality, and our free-flowing condition. Those consistent descriptions are usually housed in a CRMP, and that information is used in our determination to establish current condition, and then work to then understand what the contrast or potential effects might be of this new water resources project. So good information, the baseline, it exists, and then comparing what's actually going to happen to those resources through the new project. Next. It exists, just repeat their section 7A, but the most important thing here, it is not an outright prohibition. But to my point about anti-degradation enhancement policy, section 10 and all that stuff and how it kind of dovetails together in the whole process, there's no balancing or weighing one value over another. So what this is saying, and this comes also from Stillwater, is and the act that ultimately we are evaluating every single impacts on every single ORV that's been stated for that river water quality and free flowing condition, and any direct and adverse effect on any one of those values could then mean that the whole determination is a direct and adverse effect, and some changes have to happen. And the other thing that came out of years and years of doing 7As is this idea of if you have impacts to one ORV, enhancements to another ORV do not mitigate those impacts. So it's that idea that it's no net impacts across the board. All right, thank you. Invade the area and reasonably diminish. I'll put a few definitions here. Invade, encroach, or intrude upon. The classic example is the backwater of a dam. You know, that water invades, but ultimately, you know, we're looking at, again, connections. Can you see it? How is it recreated? What's the connectivity for the wildlife? And unlike a Section 7A determination that typically has under direct and adverse effect, you're evaluating all values. You're only evaluating the three here: scenery, recreation, and fish and wildlife at the time, as they were at the time of designation. Anti-degradation enhancement applies. So, just where are we with those resources and how are we affecting those three resources? Next. And then this one here, we've talked about it already. The unreasonably is removed. And it means a lot because it essentially freezes the picture for a river and gives it a chance to be considered to be added to the system without any major changes. Typically, that's how it works. Every once in a while, there's something's written in one way or another. But for the most part, what we're trying to do is freeze everything to give the opportunity for the river to be designated. So
I'm going to ask a quick question from Mary because it's right about where you're at. How does the Section 7 process actually get triggered? Is it automatic once a river is designated?
Ultimately, once the river is designated, and the next slide may get to this. Here's a one process, and then I'll get to the answer to that question. So there is a typical process that we follow. The main thing here is that we at any project, almost every project is going to touch the Army Corps of Engineers. So it's this idea of, most water resource projects, not all of them, will touch the Army Corps of Engineers. So what is the trigger? Free-flowing condition is really, when you brass tacks it, it's the trigger. In-stream work then brings in all the ORVs and everything else. But the trigger is usually, are you working within the ordinary high water mark of the river? So in this process here, what I wanted to point out a couple things is, number one is that last bullet there that says get involved early and often. This is to your point. If you know something's going to be happening in the river, there's a project, the earlier we are involved in the project, the more successful we can be in, for lack of a better term, enforcing, but certainly implementing the Wild Scenic Rivers Act to the most effective and best benefit to the river. I also like to remind folks that this is a process where it's required measures, the conditions that we add to or are included in a 7A determination, they're conditions, they're not comments. And that's very important because oftentimes we see ourselves as cooperating, and we obviously are looking for win-wins and cooperating with agencies, that kind of thing. But when it comes to 7A, we have an opportunity to come to the table and say, hey, with setting the standards, setting the parameters for success, and saying, if you get out of those parameters, we need to make some changes. And it's somewhat non-discretionary, which is kind of a fun thing sometimes. So
Hector, can I clarify my question quickly?
Yes.
This might apply to other participants. I am speaking as a citizen. So as someone who would be associated with, say, a nonprofit organization that supports the river, what I am trying to understand is, say, for example, a developer sends in an application to the Army Corps of Engineering, and all these things check. Is this something that someone there says, oops, this is something that we need to pass on to Section 7, or does someone need to do what you're, when you are saying we, who is the we that you are talking about?
Okay, well, and there might be a good example towards the end that kind of talks a little bit about this. The bottom line is, and I think I mentioned earlier, that Section 7A is a check on federal actions. So if you're I'm getting into the private real quick. If you're a private landowner and you want to do a bank stabilization project on your property, you need a permit from another federal agency. You need a 404 permit. Maybe it's FEMA money because of flooding. So maybe there's some federal monies involved, those kinds of things. if that condition exists, and this work requires a permit for the Corps because it's in the Northern High watermark. If all that exists, then that private activity, right? We're not actually regulating the private activity directly, but the federal elements of a project that have to happen, that is the trigger. That's this idea of I have it, and the public can actually, I think we have an example that'll explain it a little better. There's a role the public can play. This is just a quick, there's several tools that, we're developing over time. This is a nice flow chart that exists in, I think it's rivers.gov and the Interagency Coordinating Council website. I'm not don't have the time to really go through it and everything, but it does a good job of sending you down through the process and making decisions about what is the appropriate evaluation standard to use for a particular project. In the previous slide, if you notice, there was a form, a document there was pictured next to the process. That is not a flow chart, but it's a form that kind of also that I've developed at the National Park Service that helps people essentially meet the intent of the law by filling out basically the flow chart and doing it that way. These are just different ways to help us understand the process and make sure all the boxes are checked, resulting in good projects protective of the river.
I've put both the form and the flow chart in the chat.
Okay, next. And here the point of this is we should have a positive relationship with the Corps. We probably work with the Corps more than anybody else, but it's also important to understand that we have a checking relationship. Back to the conditions versus comments. The Corps of Engineers, this is a nationwide permit, General Condition 16. What it says is that there's a pre-notification that's supposed to happen to the Wild Scenic River managing agencies or administering agencies every time there's going to be a water resources project, a project that requires a 404 permit or some sort of permit from the Corps. They're supposed to tell us first. And that's back to the triggers. That's where our involvement usually starts is, there's a project. It's a Wild Scenic River. Go to the National Park Service or somebody else, one of the administering agencies first to hash out, the appropriate, implementation considerations, conditions and whatnot. That gets included or otherwise forwarded to the assisting agency, in this case, the Corps of Engineers, and the process continues. But essentially, the permit or the funding requires an okay or a concurrence from, say, the National Park Service or one of the other agencies prior to implementation or, permitting. And with that, I'm sending this to Dave now, and we have a couple of examples that might hopefully illustrate a little bit your question a little better as well.
Morning, everyone. Just to get back to that same question, projects come to us from wherever, communication, partnerships, all that stuff happens long before projects start. The Army Corps is supposed to let us know if they have a project, they bring it to us. A lot of times we can hear from developers, we can hear from landowners, we can hear from, our preferred consultants, our counties, all those type of people. But basically there's no protection for a river if no one knows it's protected and what the protection is about. But, the sooner we can hear of something, go back a little, Risa, please. The sooner we can get out and start working with those plans. It's a lot harder once they've spent, $100,000 on a set of plans that is a project that we're never going to let them allow them to do. We want to hear early. We want to talk a lot about it. We want to be great partners with our counties, our game and fish, our state, agencies, all that type of stuff. A lot of this is about relationships, and things can come at us from a lot of angles. A lot of people don't know they need a permit. A lot of people think they're going to hire their good friend Joe down the street with a giant excavator to do the project and dump a bunch of broken parking lot pieces down the riverbank, but they come from different places. Just going through a quick case study today. happened in a while back on the Snake River, south of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a designated river. It was 2011. The state's record snowpack and above average participation in the spring caused a massive landslide in the Snake River Canyon. It was on May 14th. Slowly moving mass of mud and rock crossed US Highway 89, blocking about 300 feet of the road, covering pavement with depths up to 65 feet, and eventually damming the Snake River. Let's go to the next slide. That's kind of what it looked like at first. Definitely shut that highway down, and it was going to be a big one. First thing that the state proposed was to push that landslide back all the way back into the river, because that's where all that debris was going anyways. We had to quickly put the brakes on pushing the landslide down into the river. The river did get dammed. Moving along, so the River Canyon is a route that comes up from basically it's right at the Wyoming and Idaho border. It's a route that goes up the River Canyon with that, a lot of people are crossing that every day. So that's the basic line right there of that road. Click again, please, Risa. That's basically Jackson right there. Huge amount of people coming that direction. Click again. That's kind of where our spot was, and click again. That's kind of the detour route. It basically added about 74 more miles each way of commuting to work each day. So 74, 2 mountain passes, more hours, more everything for people trying to get from our bedroom communities up to work in Jackson Hole where all the jobs are. And so really hard on people with kids in daycare or dogs that are in the house all day, all that type of stuff, massive inconvenience. So that was a big deal. Let's go to the next slide. During the cleanup, Wyoming Department of Transportation geologists became concerned that erosion from the high flows could erode the base of 2 downstream landsides, adding to existing instabilities that could cause a possible catastrophic road failure. YDOT proposed a giant boulder wall below ordinary high water mark. Next slide. So kind of this was the spot right here. Section 7 apply in this in an emergency? Absolutely. Sometimes we miss them because stuff has to happen too fast, but there is an opportunity sometimes to stay up with what's going on. And this one came fast and furious. We were trying to deal with a big messy slide that clean up of all that and putting in a new project to deal with the drainage from the draws that slide came out of. And all of a sudden, we have another problem that's directly downstream because the river has been reflected into coming into this bank. And so the proposed emergency stabilization would occur within the bed and banks of the river, thus requiring a Section 7 analysis and determination. Federal funding, federal permitting, all created the federal nexus that's required to make it a water resources project for the Wild and Scenic Deck. Adverse determination would prohibit federal agencies from assisting in construction of this project through funding and permitting. Obviously, dumping a bunch of giant rocks there is not conducive to what the Wild and Scenic Rivers asked us to do. It was immediately quite obvious that the project as proposed would be a direct and adverse impact on our Wild and Scenic River. Let's go to the next slide. So what our status was, this was an emergency, the big emergency. One thing I did do was get into the meat of things and realize that this is not a pristine riverbank. This riverbank has been mauled for a lot of years. Picture here is from around 1945, I believe, and that that's our area right there where none of that is there today, but it must be buried down beneath things. So we weren't trying to reestablish a perfect, healthy riverbank. It had been mauled, it had been construed. We just wanted to um, make it better than it was before this happened. Um, there was not time to do this perfectly. It highway had already been closed for 2 weeks. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the Forest Service could not have been more unpopular with all those people that have to drive that want to drive that canyon every day instead of going over 2 mountain passes. Political pressure was off the charts. We got 2 states, we got 2 sets of congressionals, we got 2 governors, we got all sorts of angry, influential people, and they want that damn highway opened up right now. And they didn't care about our silly River Protection Act. So yeah, critical to 10,000 commuters each way twice a day. And so this was a big one. Where we got to on this, let's go to the next slide. We bumped our heads. It's like, how can we do this? One of the things that they mentioned during this that I picked up on is this was a temporary need. It wasn't a forever need. And so that was a big one. They just needed to get in there, get this fixed, and get us through this high water situation. So we went with that. How could we get a good project done, get the heat off, not have all that pressure on us, and have a little time to do it right? So we declared the repair as temporary. That was one of our situation. That's something we said it's temporary. The genius of that was they would have to go back and do it right later. And so, we felt that once the water comes out and drops, you'd have a better idea what's needed, better things to do. We could pull out the emergency riprap. We could replace it with an intervention that would have a more favorable Section 7 result. And we could install something. It still wouldn't be perfect given the riverbank condition over the last 100 years, but we could make it better than it was before the slide. Actually, when they did the project, they came in with those hard rocks. It actually started partway up the bank between the highway and the river. The bank started coming out like that. So it was too solid at the bottom. So it started blowing out the middle, which became a whole another big issue. But this is what we came up with. Let's go to the next slide. That's kind of what they looked like. They started heading down, they started building a road down to that area where you can see the tree, and that's where they're going to do their thing. They did what they were asked to. And then they pulled that road out of there. They rehabbed everything, and they planned never to come back. We expected that. Great expense to them because we did make them come back. Let's go to the next slide. So yeah, what we went through. This was an all-nighter Section 7 that I wrote. It required a lot of immediate time and few meals, that type of thing. But sometimes that's what you have to do to protect your river and make things go right. Otherwise, you can back off and say, "Oh, it's too big a deal," and we'll let DOT have its way with us. It's not a good idea. You can end up with something really bad or worse than what you ever could imagine. We did make DOT return to make the changes. It took a little while to get them, and they had to build that whole road back down and build that whole road back up, and take that whole road out. It had to rehab everything again. They were mighty crabby, but we got it done. That was in the Section 7. One of the good things is we had addressed critical infrastructure needs in our CRMP, our Comprehensive River Management Plan. And it facilitated being able to manage issues like this a lot better, of coming to terms in our planning that, hey, stuff happens on the river. Bridges are going to be threatened. Infrastructure, $1 million infrastructure is going to be threatened. And we're not going to be in a good place to say, oh, no, you need to lose that $26 million bridge because, we want to futz around or whatever. Emergency stuff does come up. Plan for it ahead of time. Realizing that the riverbank had been dug up, rebuilt, engineered, dug back up, buried again, twisted over, more things installed in it. Over the last 70 years, was a game changer. Made things a lot easy. Nothing is ever perfect, but we couldn't come up with anything that we could have done better in this. We have, in the end, we got what we needed. Uh, I'm glad we went through that. There was a lot of people that wanted to try and keep that road shut down for 6 months while we tried to make that the pristine caveman era time riverbank. That wasn't an option. We had to move. We had to move quick, and it was getting ugly. So out of it, we got a new rapid. So from the double draw slide. So that's what it looked like that year. Big old crystal-sized hole there. But that's the end of my case study. I'll look at. Do I have questions?
Great.
Go
What
ahead,
I'm going to
Hector.
do sorry, I'm going to try to get through this one pretty quickly because I see there's a lot of questions. The next example we have here is Little Beaver Creek, Ohio. It's a state-administered river in northeastern Ohio. And the big point about the state-administered is to make the point that Section 7A applies in the same way on federal land, federally managed land, as it does on state and private land with respect to water resources projects. So that was the point of this. 2A2s, 3As, whatever, all rivers, Section 7A applies the same way. Remember, it's a check on the federal actions. Next. The problem here, there was an exposed gas pipeline. And the secondary problem was all this erosion that's happening was actually going, migrating towards an existing road with no opportunity to move the road. Next. Oh, the other direction. Okay, so from 7A perspective, ultimately here, it was a horizontal directional drill. That typically, in this case, a non-navigable river, non-navigable list. So ultimately, 7A didn't apply. But everything else happening in the river, the open trench method, removal of pipes, the subsequent bank stabilization, all that was subject to 7A. And we had to work with our state, in particular the state of Ohio. It's a state-administered river. So I made sure to loop in the state of Ohio as a decision-making partner in the project. Next. Okay. Preferred approach was horizontal directional drill, and we had a precedent with other rivers, Big Darby Creek, Marathon pipe exposure as well. I had literally a 7A that was already written to hand them. Hey, if you do it this way, it's a very easy 7A. Ultimately, there are reasons why in this case, next slide, there's a reason why in this case, HDD was actually not the best option. Okay. And so the one thing we can do through the process is demand from the project proponent, hey, you're telling me you can't do an HDD. Why is that? Justify that. And then we have some, decisions and some discretion to make. So certainly in this project, we pursue the holistic approach, trying to solve multiple problems. All right, next slide. Okay, so ultimately we came up with a new plan. It involved an open cut for a reason, because they had to open cut anyways to pull the other pipe out. What I wanted was the pipe to be not covered by grout bags, which is what they wanted to do, but actually sent deep enough to where it wouldn't interact with the river anymore. So the compromise is, okay, use the same hole you're pulling the other pipe in to do that. The other thing is that with gas lines, ultimately by law, they had to be exposed above the right-of-way either way. So a horizontal directional drill through existing corridor was still going to be an impact because they were going to have to mow all the trees down anyways. So pretty impacted stream bed anyways because it was existing roadway, so or a right-of-way. So we just decided open cut in this case was actually the better option. We got protected values more, more effectively. So next. And then here's just a couple pictures of the practice. Ultimately, there was a road involved, so there is some stone there, but we break it up with our root wad revetments and with our stone encapsulated lifts. Next. These are just a few pictures of what it's starting to look like. I don't have one more. I don't have the most current picture, but it's springtime and things are starting to green up just like this, but that was a year ago. So, and the only other thing I want to mention here is this idea of, that as part of the process and working with the state, we were also able to ensure a lot of this area is actually going to be, for example, permanently protected in conservation easements, and making sure that trees remained, and working with landowners. All of those pieces through the process allowed us to at least not muck around with the river too much in terms of the substrates downstream and upstream. There's hellbenders involved and other important species. But at the same time, just make sure that, we protect it permanently. So all that happened just in conversations through the process. And then Taylor, you can send us home.
Hey, I was just answering the question in the chat, so let me get my thanks, Mary, for the good questions. So we're going to talk a little bit of a summary here for what essentially talking about what we just covered here. And this Section 7 is a key provision. It's sometimes called the heart of the act. I like that language, that protects rivers from harmful effects of hydropower and water resources projects. So it's a written assessment done by the River Administering Agency in most cases of how a project can affect river-related values. And those river-related values that we're talking about specifically are free-flowing condition, outstandingly remarkable values, and water quality. And free-flowing condition is the one that we really focus in on in a lot of these definitions especially, but all three of these key river values are very important. So it prohibits licensing of new hydropower facilities. The River Administering Agency is required to review modifications of the waterway that could affect the free-flowing condition of rivers. That agency is required to evaluate a project and make the Section 7 determination. And generally that determination and the signing of the determination is at a very high level in most of the agencies. And the outcome determines whether a federal agency can permit, fund, or assist with the project. If there are adverse effects to river values, then the project cannot proceed as proposed. So I will turn it over to Risa to wrap us up.
So thank you guys, and thanks for helping us honor everyone's time here. So this concludes the seminar, the webinar. And we have one more in our series. Again, it'll be on May 20th, talking about the eligible rivers and how to manage eligible rivers. They're not all the same. So it kind of varies depending on where they are. If you have we were trying to answer the questions. If there are a couple outstanding, we'll answer them right at the last here. And then we have a survey. We would love for you to, it just takes a minute or two. And want to thank you for attending. And Matt, Mary, you want contact info? Yes, to follow up. Yes. Yeah, we'll make sure that you have that. Actually, if Dave and Hector and Taylor can put your email addresses in the chat, that would be awesome. And I am going to conclude the recording. And so thanks very much again.